welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. It's amazing what one question in these Q&A episodes can provoke, and the recent question and the answer about army pay, how soldiers were paid and what they were paid, provoked quite a lot of correspondence to the Old Front Line office, with emails coming in with some follow-up questions on this subject. And this is true of quite a lot of the questions that we put out there. It's always interesting to get emails from you where you either provide a bit of follow-up information or a follow-up question that kind of leads us down another little avenue. But I'm sure we will return to some of those follow-up questions about pay and who was paid and when in another Q&A episode. But we're still getting a lot of questions coming in. The ones from this episode date from around about September into October, so you can see just how many come in. And please keep sending them. I find them absolutely fascinating, and they have enabled us to discuss quite a lot of different subjects. So as always, you can send them in. All of the ones this week have come in via email, so you can send them in via email or use the Discord server where you can leave a question on there. And details of both of those are in the show notes for this episode. So without further ado, let's get down to our first question this week, and this one comes from Joe. Joe asks, what's the difference between an ordnance map and a trench map? I know that the trench map shows the trench system, but what was the purpose of an ordnance map system? Well, if we look at the maps that the British Army had on the outbreak of the war, the ones that they took to France and Belgium with them, they were maps that were prepared on behalf of the War Office by Ordnance Survey. Now, Ordnance Survey hadn't gone over to all those places where the First World War would one day be fought, like Mons and Ypres and the Aisne and the Marne, and surveyed those areas. What they had done is bought in foreign map data, so map data from those countries, from France and from Belgium, and a much wider area within Europe, bought in that map data and created their own maps from that data. So essentially, to kind of use a modern phrase, they'd kind of cut and pasted that data from those European maps into the maps that were created by the War Office that were then taken overseas. Now, not all the units that went overseas even got those maps. I think there was a shortage of them, and it was underestimated kind of what maps would be needed and how many would be needed. But it was those Ordnance Survey maps were the maps that the British Army started off with in 1914. And you may well have seen those kind of maps if that's what's prompted your question. You find them in quite a lot of 1914 war diaries, for example. You also see them as some of the maps in the map volumes of the official history. But going back to those original maps, what they found when the British Army went to war, and particularly once that war became static and they were firing over fixed positions and needed to know the contours of the ground ahead of them so they could set their artillery to fire over a hill, they found that a lot of this map data wasn't that accurate. So they had to basically start again. They scrapped the use of all those early maps, and the British Army, the Royal Engineers, began with field survey units to survey the battlefield area from the ground and also from the air, because obviously those Royal Engineer units couldn't break through the trench system and get behind the German positions to map all of the approaches, their approaches to the battlefield, and where their camps were and where their airfields were, where their gun positions were, their ammunition depots, all that kind of stuff. So it had to be done using a number of different sources. And we've spoken about this in an episode on aerial photography earlier on in the podcast. So using these kind of methods, the survey units would survey battlefield areas and create the new trench maps. And these maps largely produced in 1 to 10,000 scale and 1 to 20,000 scale. The earlier ordnance maps were often more like 1 to 200,000, some were 1 to 40,000, but they were very different kind of scales and covering much bigger areas. The nature of static warfare is that you want to know a lot about a very small area. So the trench maps cover much smaller parts of the line, and they show the Allied positions on one side and then the German positions on the other side. And the whole kind of history of mapping develops over the course of the next few years of the static war on the Western Front and becomes essential, really, in commanders and men on the ground understanding the battlefield, the landscape that they're fighting on, and finding ways to overcome the problems of that landscape and the problems of the defences that are mapped on these trench maps and the defences that cut across that landscape. So they really become absolutely essential in the path to victory in 1918. Without decent maps, then you really can't hope to win a battle, let alone a campaign, let alone a war. So maps were really important. And jumping on 100 years, they remain important. Maps are very much, certainly for me, the currency of history. We talk a lot about landscape in this podcast. So to understand that landscape, you need maps. You need the maps of the past, whether the ordnance maps or the trench maps that were produced by the army, or whether it's the modern maps, the IGN, Institut Géographique National, French maps, and the Belgian equivalent of that cover those main British sectors, British and Commonwealth sectors of the Western Front, and the IGN maps follow that all the way, of course, down to the end of the Western Front in the Vosges. You can get digital versions of those as well as the paper ones, and I still buy the paper ones myself because I think paper maps remain incredibly important in being able to spread them out on the table and look at that landscape and visualize that landscape and make notes on that landscape by making notes on the maps. So really, maps, just as for the men who fought the Great War in 1914-18, remain incredibly important more than a century later in our understanding and our comprehension, and also our ability to react with that landscape today. So really important. So I think what your question has kind of opened up there, Joe, is kind of a wider aspect of the importance of maps. And we've looked at aerial photography. Maps is very much linked into that. And it's been on the cards for me for quite some time to do an episode on trench maps, and hopefully that might be something that comes up in season 8. So a great question, and thanks for that, Joe. We're going to move on to question 2 now, that comes from Steve McQuaid. Steve says, as I am home alone for a couple of weeks, I was looking at what is available on YouTube, and frankly, without a guide, it appears pointless to try, as there is so much dodgy stuff on there of dubious quality. Hence this request for a Paul Reed, Old Frontline, top 10 online documentaries. Well, another really great question, and touches on a discussion that I had with JD Hutt on his channel, which more shortly. There is a huge amount of material on YouTube. You know, the biggest search engine in the world is Google. The second biggest search engine in the world is YouTube. And there is a massive material to do with military history and also, of course, the Great War. And you're right, there is some, you describe it as dodgy stuff, I would call it duff history. There's a lot of it on there because there is no kind of filter or quality control beyond what the terms and conditions of YouTube is. So anyone can start a channel, anyone can put material out there, anyone can pretty much say almost anything. And while some channels put a lot of work and money and time into producing good material, that isn't always the case. So as your question prompts, where do you start? Now, what I've done for this episode is do a kind of, not quite a top 10, but certainly list 10 documentaries that are on YouTube that I think are essential. 10 documentaries that the Old Frontline recommends. And I've created a YouTube playlist of these, and I've put details of that onto the podcast webpage for this episode. So you can follow the link to that in the show notes, and you'll see the playlist there. But I'm going to talk about that playlist now. There are 10 videos on there, and at the top of that list is my favourite documentary about the Great War, A Game of Ghosts. It's something that I've spoke about on this podcast many times. It dates from 1991, and it was a documentary made about some of the last veterans of the Battle of the Somme, made for the 75th anniversary of that battle, which, when you think that this year we've had the 80th anniversary of D-Day, the 75th anniversary of the Somme seems a very long time ago. And of course, it is. It's over 30 years ago, and there were a lot of veterans alive then. That was the period in which I was still interviewing veterans of the Great War. And I love it in all kinds of different ways, but particularly because some of those men that I knew are in that documentary, Alf Rozell being the top of that kind of list, really. An incredible veteran with an almost total recall of his war experience, but more than that, the ability to really verbally express how he felt, what it meant to him, and what he went through. And his contribution to A Game of Ghosts really is just beyond impressive, because it really tears at your heartstrings, as well as give you an idea as to what these men thought about their war experiences, as well as how it affected them. And I think that it's a documentary that shows the importance of oral history. We're not going to rewrite the history of the Great War based on these men's testimonies, but we're going to get an insight into the human experience of conflict, and that is certainly a central point and a central benefit, in my mind, of what oral history was all about. So, A Game of Ghosts, long since disappeared off of our screens. Thankfully, someone has uploaded a video cassette quality version of it, and you can watch it on there. So that's the kind of top of that list. Tied into that, for the next two documentaries, are two films that were made by Malcolm Brown. Malcolm was an historian and an author. He wrote several really kind of seminal books on the First World War. I read his Tommy Goes to War very early on in my interest in the Great War, and it's a book that has stuck with me ever since. He worked closely with the Imperial War Museum, but he was also a BBC producer, and he produced a whole load of material. His son has now created a channel on YouTube for his work. Not all of it is on there, but these two documentaries, which I'm sure you will find fascinating, are on there. One of them is from 1976, so the 60th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, and it's just called that, The Battle of the Somme, presented by Leo McKern. He used to be Rumpold of the Bailey, for those of you who know what that is. And it is based on Martin Middlebrook's research for his book, First Day of the Somme. Many of the soldiers that appear in his book are in that documentary. So it's dated to a certain degree with its historiography, but it's a powerful film, and one that I would very much recommend watching. And tied into that is Malcolm's later film about the Christmas truce, called A Peace in No Man's Land, where he interviews some of the men who were present at the Christmas truce. And again, for me, it's a great film because a couple of the veterans that I knew are in it, and there's a lot of material in it that he was gathering at that time for a book that he subsequently wrote with Shirley Seaton on the Christmas truce. So those two really kind of classic documentaries made by Malcolm Brown, one in the 70s, one in the 80s. They're number 2 and number 3 on this playlist that I put together for you. Number 4 is a Time Watch episode. Now, there are 1 or 2 Time Watches on iPlayer. Most of the really good ones about the First World War I don't think are on there. And again, this is only on YouTube because someone has uploaded it. And it's a Time Watch from the early 2000s that I actually worked on as an advisor, called 1914 War Revolution. And it looks at how the change in technology and the change in how wars were fought led to the peculiar circumstances that the Great War kind of created, and it led to the ability to actually fight trench warfare on the scale that the First World War did and prolong it by having the means to do so. And there's contributions in there from Gary Sheffield, from Richard Van Emden, and from Andy Robertshaw as well. And it's a really well-made documentary, one that I really enjoyed working on, and one that I would recommend looking at for a slightly different perspective on that early phase of the First World War. It's a shame that there's not more Time Watchers on there. That was a kind of golden period for history broadcasting on the BBC. Time Watch finished in 2009, and really nothing has ever replaced it. And we're really much in the doldrums, in my view, of factual television today in what is put out there. A sad state of affairs. But continuing with our list, that was number 4. Number 5, and we're going to look over the next few at a number of new channels. Well, I say new channels, but channels that are by creators, content creators, putting out material related to the Great War. And we mentioned JD Hutts, great friend of this podcast, friend of mine, really great guy who I've had the pleasure of meeting now in real life as well as online. JD does the History Underground channel, which covers a really broad spectrum of history, but he's been doing some World War I mini-series for the last couple of years, and I can't recommend these enough. He is a great producer of material on YouTube. In my mind, one of the best of the channels that are out there. His ability to talk in a meaningful way and to connect with the subject of the First World War is really great to see. And he's very kindly cited this podcast as a source for some of the research that he did to produce those series. So I've got 2 of his videos that are on that playlist. One is from his recent Arras series, where he travels to Vimy Ridge, that most incredible of memorials on the landscape of the First World War on the Western Front, and another where he goes to the ossuary at Verdun and gives his thoughts on that landscape and the scale of losses that were suffered at Verdun by both sides in 1916. And they are from some of his very best work, in my view, and I would thoroughly recommend you subscribe to that channel and all of these channels that produce the material that we're mentioning in this list. And that brings me on to Chris Mowry, another American like JD Hutt, who produces vlogging through history, and also his kind of spin-off from that, which is Tales of the Great War. And I've recommended his episode on the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. So it's really interesting for me, having produced a video on that myself, given my thoughts on it. It's great to see Chris's thoughts as an American on what is the largest American military cemetery in Europe and what that means to an American audience and to the American people over 100 years from America's contribution to the Great War. So go and check that out. Rob Sambles is a British content creator on YouTube, and he started his channel not that long ago, I don't think, where he looks at both the First and the Second World War in what he calls History in Your Hand. And Rob kind of goes on a journey of discovery. He doesn't claim to be an expert as such, but he does his homework, and then he goes to a battlefield location and he explores it kind of like the rest of us do when we go there for the first time. And he did quite a few videos recently on the Loos battlefield, which I was really pleased to see. One of the forgotten battlefields, the lesser visited battlefields of the Great War on the Western Front, part of that wider forgotten front. And the episode that I put on there looks at the missing of the Battle of Loos with a visit to the Loos Memorial. So check that one out. And then at number 9, we've got Great War Huts, their channel. Now that's a project that Taff Gillingham heads up. He's been on the podcast before talking about Great War Huts, and it's a project which is kind of a museum, and they've created a trench system there. And what he does is a regular series of documentaries looking at different aspects of the First World War. The one that I've put on there is one of his absolute specialities, which is British uniforms and equipment of the First World War. But what he's doing right now for December, and they've been doing this for a few years, is a kind of World War I advent calendar where every day they release a short little video looking at an object or a particular subject, and they discuss it just for a few minutes. And that is really good, really worth signing up for that, joining that channel, following that channel, and following those little Advent movies as they work through the month of December, looking at all those different aspects of First World War history. And our final number 10 on that playlist is the Great War Channel, which is quite a big American channel, which looks at the kind of pure history, I suppose, of the First World War from all kinds of different angles, from the Western Front to the Eastern Front to Gallipoli to Palestine, Mesopotamia, a whole host of material. I mean, there is tons and tons of films on there for you to lock into. I find them really well made, really well researched, and the one that I've linked to is the Battle of the Somme, which gives you a kind of history of the Battle of the Somme in about 20 odd minutes. So all of these are a starting point. They're not the only channels out there, they're not the only films out there, but this is a pretty good starting point. And once you start watching these, YouTube will recommend some others, and you'll see people recommend some others, and then you'll find your way through this kind of absolute mass of material that is out there on YouTube. So a great question, Steve, and I hope that playlist is of interest to you all. So moving on to question number 3, and this is kind of tied into the last one because this question comes from JD Hutt. So thank you, JD, for this one. JD asks, what has been your favourite regiment in the First World War to study, and what has drawn you to them? Also, is there a regiment that you would recommend a person study whose experiences would give one a comprehensive look at the Great War? Well, if you go back through the podcast catalogue and you listen to what I say, you know that I'm born in Sussex, and you know that I've done a lot of research on the Royal Sussex Regiment, and I mention them quite a lot, whether it's their regular battalions, their territorials, South Downs battalions, whatever it is. So that is something that stayed with me for a long time. And I'm not saying that's my favourite regiment, but because the county of Sussex is where I was born, and I've walked the South Downs and so many parts of that county and visited hundreds and hundreds of war memorials across Sussex, I kind of feel very connected to their part in the Great War. And my research on that regiment kind of gave me an insight into the wider conflict through the eyes of one unit. So it's been incredibly useful to me over the years because I've understood how one regiment functioned, how it recruited, how it trained men, how it formed its battalions, what those battalions did, and there is a kind of wider pattern that fits into other regiments, all of the other regiments of the British Army. So that's a kind of good approach. So you ask which regiment should you pick. What I would say is pick a regiment that is relevant to you, and also kind of look for regiments where there are quite a lot of memoirs of some of the guys that served in it, or battalion histories that you can tie into. With the Sussex, I was very lucky that there was a kind of general history. There was a history of the 7th Battalion, which was one of the service battalions, and there was a later history of the Sussex Yeomanry, which became the 16th Royal Sussex. So that gave me some unit histories. There was a few other studies of the 4th and 5th Battalions of Territorials that you could also tie into as well. And there was a very good county archive, regimental archive, where there was a lot of material that I could use for that as well. So that is a good example. But if you do your kind of homework and pick a regiment in an area that you're somehow connected to or interested in, or if you've been to a part of the Western Front, you might have seen a particular cap badge of a unit and been drawn to that and thought, I'd like to know more about that regiment, find out where their archives are, find out what kind of books were published on the units within that regiment, and that kind of brings all of it together. And you don't need just regiments, you can do that with corps. Obviously, they're much bigger, like the artillery and the engineers. Then you've got a kind of greater task to try and understand that. But it's not impossible. And all of those have histories, and all of those have individual unit histories that tell you a lot about the kind of composition of the different units that serve within those corps as well. But another regiment that I have researched a lot of, particularly when I was doing my master's degree, I did a whole project on the London Regiment because I was living and working in London at that time, and the London Regiment fascinated me, the largest territorial regiment in the British Army. So the Territorial Force, later the Territorial Army, the London Regiment were all territorial battalions. There were 26 of them on the outbreak of the war, each one their own little mini regiment, recruiting in particular areas, recruiting from particular professions or particular backgrounds. So You have working class battalions that are the Fusilier battalions of the London Regiment, the 1st, the 2nd, 3rd and 4th. Then you have the London Rifle Brigade, the 5th. You have units like the London Scottish, recruiting from the Scottish community in London. The Civil Service Rifles, recruiting from those who worked, obviously, for the civil service, with the headquarters at Somerset House. And a whole kind of host of really fascinating units. And what I did when I was doing my MA is I took the London Regiment as an example of how the British Army expanded, and also how you could kind of have a look at a regiment like that from a wider perspective with what was then some of the most recently released records. So when I did my MA in the early 90s, they'd just released the service records and the medal records. Now, medal records are not massively used by historians, which I think is a bit of a shame, because they do actually have quite a lot to tell us. So what I did, I used the medal rolls of the London battalions that had the 1914 or 1914-15 style, which was quite a big chunk of the battalions of the London Regiment who went overseas in 1914 and 1915, and I used them to try and work out class within those battalions, because it's quite clear when you read some of the histories that some of those battalions were very much kind of middle class and others were not. They were from the working class areas of London. But how do you work that out for the whole lot? And one of the ways was to see how many men from those individual battalions were commissioned as officers before the Army Act changed, which enabled anybody to seek a commission as an officer in the British Army. Prior to that, you had to have gone to an approved school. So if you came from a working class part of London and you went to the local state school equivalent of before the Great War, you were not going to get a commission in 1914 to 16, for example. So I went through the medal rolls and literally put together a chart of how many commissions there were in each battalion. And it was no surprise that units like the London Scottish, which had a joining fee before the war of £10 and was very much a middle-class battalion, and a unit like the Civil Service Rifles, drawn from the civil service, more educated men, perhaps men from different kind of educational backgrounds, they had high levels of men being commissioned. And those Fusilier battalions and the Hackney Battalion, the 10th Londons from working class areas, didn't have very many at all. So again, this is kind of an example of what you can do with records by picking a particular regiment to use it to understand the wider aspects of First World War history. So those are a couple of examples that I've used in my career as an historian, the Royal Sussex and the London Regiment, because there were two areas that I kind of connected with, because I'd lived there, grown up in one, lived and worked in another one, and it kind of gave me a wider insight into so many other aspects of the First World War, and also attuned me to the stories of individual soldiers within those units that I've then gone on to research and visit graves on the battlefields and study their diaries. So it's a fascinating path to follow, picking on a particular regiment and following it as it weaves its way through those crisscross pathways of the Great War. So a brilliant question, JD. Thanks for that, mate. Our fourth and final question comes from Peter Malloy. Peter says, I'm curious about the types of souvenirs soldiers brought home after the First World War. By this I mean both issued kit items and those that they hung on to in civilian life, as well as items souvenired from the enemy. You obviously got to know many veterans during the 80s and 90s. Did any still have wartime souvenirs at that stage? If so, were any items more common than others? Well, this is an interesting question, Peter, and I'm going to look at this solely from a British Army point of view, because I suspect certain formations had different attitudes to this. The Australians, I know, for example, were far more relaxed about souvenirs being taken home than the British Army. Generally, soldiers were not encouraged to souvenir on a battlefield. There was a fine line between souveniring and looting, for example. That didn't mean that soldiers obeyed that command, and when you look at the accounts of the First World War, you see this going on quite a lot. I remember looking at some papers in the National Archives many years ago of some officers, I think it was the Royal Naval Air Service, who were court-martialed for stealing artefacts from amongst the ruins of the city of Ypres fairly early on in the First World War. So there was that kind of thing going on. On the battlefield, of course, when soldiers went forward and they captured an enemy position, It wasn't uncommon for men of both sides to take souvenirs. For British soldiers, they were always after the Pickelhaube. And I remember Albert Rose talking about this. He was in the Queen's Westminster Rifles, 16th London Regiment. He went over the top at Gommecourt on the first day of the Somme, and he had a mate who was absolutely crazy about getting a Pickelhaube. That was what he wanted to do in the big push that was coming. Top of his list was not defeating the army, marching to Berlin, but it was getting a Pickelhaube to take home as a war souvenir. And when they got into the German trenches at Gommecourt, he went into a dugout, saw a Pickelhaube sitting on a table, rushed down the steps, grabbed it by the spike, and what he didn't see was a cable coming from underneath it with a grenade underneath the table, and as he lifted it, it ignited the grenade, and he was killed instantly in the explosion. It was a booby trap. So picking up souvenirs was not without danger. And again, I remember Malcolm Vivian talking about an NCO in his siege battery who was really keen on getting souvenirs. He liked to dig up the fuses from enemy shells that dropped close to their gun position, and he got a little bit too enthusiastic one day doing this, dug up this fuse, grabbed it with both his hands, and it was still red hot, and he got severe burns from handling this, which got him to the casualty clearance station, that got him to the hospital in England, and got him discharged from the army because his burns to his hands were so severe that he couldn't really use those hands again for the rest of his life. So the price of those souvenirs for him was very, very high indeed. So technically, soldiers, unlike in the American army, for example, in the Second World War, where they could register their kind of souvenirs and the government would agree to them taking them home, British soldiers were generally not given that option. And some did manage to smuggle souvenirs back. Others, again, talking to some veterans, they used to tell me that what they would do is they would look for booty on the battlefield, and they would then use it to swap with men behind the lines who were never on the battlefield to give them the war booty in exchange for strong liquor, cigarettes, chocolate, all kinds of other things. So there was this kind of trade in these souvenirs actually on the battlefield, wider battlefield area and behind the lines during the conflict itself. But I know from collecting Great War material and, as you mentioned, meeting veterans in the 80s and 90s, that many men did bring things back. Now, officers had a great opportunity to do that. So whenever I interviewed a Great War veteran who was an officer, I always knew that they were going to have a box load of stuff. Malcolm Vivian had his trench maps that were still covered in Somme mud. He had aerial photographs of Lens and Hill 70, where he fought supporting the Canadians in 1917. He had his battery history. He had some of his notes that he'd taken on the battlefield, all kinds of stuff like this. And he told me that he'd brought home with him, because officers brought their own kit, he brought all his kit back with him. He'd given some of it to his uncle, who was a parish priest in Cornwall, who had kind of sold it in a jumble to raise money for homeless people. He'd given his boots and greatcoat away to people over the years who were a lot less fortunate than he was. And Jimmy Lovegrove, an infantry officer in the South Lancs, he had all his photographs, his air photos, some of his maps, a few bits and pieces. In his garden, he had his old haversack hanging up on a peg in his shed, and although these weren't originals, he had an area where he grew peas, and he had lines of twine between them on these posts, and the posts were exact copies of barbed wire pickets of the type that his men had erected in front of the trenches they defended in 1917-18. So there was a kind of a bit of an echo of the First World War there with how he did that. Now, ordinary soldiers, they tended not to have as much as that. A few of them had a few bits of equipment. When soldiers were discharged, ordinary soldiers, they could take a payment from the army, or they could take their greatcoat home with them. Most took the payment. A few took their greatcoat, and one of the guys I interviewed had his, which he was very, very proud of. He'd worn it in the last year of his service on the Western Front, so it meant an awful lot to him. Sadly, got thrown away when he died. But most of the ordinary soldiers, if they had souvenirs, they tended to be on the small side, particularly if they'd been in infantry units, because an infantry soldier can only souvenir what he can carry. So he's not going to pick up a trench mortar or a machine gun and put that in his knapsack. He's going to pick up small items and stash them away. So a common thing that these guys had were German belt buckles, were iron crosses that they picked up off of prisoners of war, In some cases, I'm pretty sure they probably came from the dead. Some had the woven epaulets that were part of the German uniform that had the regimental number on it, which they'd taken off of uniforms, for example. That wasn't an uncommon thing. A few had photographs that they'd taken from German soldiers as well, pay books and things like that. Again, I didn't always closely examine them as to where those had come from. When you see images of the battlefield, you see the dead lying around. Very often their tunics are open and their pockets have gone through, and soldiers have looked for watches and cigarettes and all kinds of things. It's the grim reality of the battlefield. And whenever I see that kind of thing come up for sale, I have a pay book, for example, or some paperwork of a German soldier who was at Courcelette, and I often wonder what the circumstances were of that being taken by a British soldier, Canadian soldier in 1916. But some had some slightly more unusual souvenirs. So Frank Plum, he was an ordinary soldier. He served in the 11th Suffolk Regiment as a sergeant. He was really badly wounded in 1918. I think I've told his story on the podcast. He was hit by a large piece of shell that threw him across this hut and completely dislocated his jaw and caused horrific facial injuries. And he was lucky to end up in a field hospital where an very early American plastic surgeon worked, and he helped rebuild his face. And Frank had bits of the shrapnel. He had all of the kind of metalware that had been used to hold his face together and then help rebuild his face. He had all of that in a drawer, and one or two other kind of grim things that had all been part of his life being saved, which is why he kept them, I guess. And they kind of helped give a bit of an insight into that. And then hanging on his wall very proudly in Gifford House in Worthing, where he lived in the last few years of his life, was his discharge certificate, which was given to him by the army after the war for having been medically discharged through combat experience on the battlefield. So that tied in with those wartime souvenirs that he brought back from the trenches. So all of these objects are really, really important in our understanding of military history, in particular the Great War, 1914 tin. I mean, almost all of the veterans that I knew had one of those. Even if they'd not been in France in 1914, they'd souvenired it off someone else, won it in some gambling, whatever. And very often I'd go to a veteran's house and that would be on the shelf above the fireplace, and in there would be their medals. That was a really, really common thing to see. So these objects, really powerful, really important. They connected the veterans to part of their war history, and they connect us more than a century later to the wider history of the Great War. And objects, I know, is something we will return to again and again in this podcast. So thank you, Peter, for that question. And thanks to you all for the questions for this week. We've gone on slightly longer than usual. Hope you found them of interest. See you again for more questions, and with them the answers, in the next episode of the Q&As of the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.